Financial planning in your 80s. Maybe you're not in your 80s, but maybe your parents or your grandparents are, and these are the questions you should be asking. How do you work with an advisor in your 80s? What's the best investment allocation? What is the best way to gift? How should you best plan for care expenses? Should you set up charitable strategies? Why you should definitely review your estate plan, and why the kids of those in their 80s should be involved in the planning process when it comes to money. We'll address these questions and more on this episode of Through the Pines. All right, welcome to a financial planning podcast with the down-to-earth vibe Sasquatch listens while trimming the tree. This is Through the Pines, financial planning in your 80s. Aren't you on autopilot by then? So, Brandon, I don't know if this was your subject or Rex's or Dan's or a collaborative, but it's a good one because we're talking about those in their 80s.
Yeah, I think this is our last decades one. I think it was Rex's idea in the first place to do a podcast of every decade and what you should think of. And so this kind of wraps us up. So thanks for having us on today.
Do you have someone in their 80s that is in your family that can listen to this podcast?
You know, I do. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll have to share it with my grandma.
Yeah, that is good. All right, let's dive in. Introducing our guests, our financial planners are Rex.m.Baxter, Brandon Smith, and Dan Nelson, all with planwithbaxter.com. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Find their services at planwithbaxter.com. If at any time you'd like to open a tab and go to that website, you can do that and listen to the live podcast at the same time. How does your relationship with your advisor change in your 80s? Okay, so this says frequently overlooked, but even if you're working with a 40-year-old advisor, when you retire in your 60s, that advisor is going to be looking at retiring when you're in your 80s.
Yeah.
How about that?
And that's the last thing you want to be doing is advisor shopping in your 80s or 90s.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so what's the plan?
Yeah, and it's one that gets overlooked a lot, I think, because, you know, when you're getting ready to retire, rarely are you looking for an advisor in his 20s, you know, and so really the best way to get around that is have a good team, a team that is consciously building out a plan. For example, I mean, Dan's, you know, been doing this about 40 years or over 40 years, Rex over 25 years, myself over 12 years. And then, you know, we'll probably bring on another advisor in a few years to carry on that legacy, to help clients know who they're working with, to help people just have that smooth transition. Because no single advisor is going to be able to take you from your, 30s all the way into your 80s just by, the nuances of a career.
Rex is going to know this one. Rex, it's a romantic comedy where he knows he's going to die, but he leaves all the love letters, and then she follows the love letter. You know what movie I'm talking about?
Yeah.
What's it called? I just thought of it.
I can't think of the name, but
it's Gerard Butler in it.
Love letters? It might be love letters.
Might be love letters. Yeah. That's how I imagine a financial advisor he was like, hey, I'm retired. I'm out. Here's all my love letters to you and your finances. Figure it out. But Rex, you don't have to do it that way, right?
Well, you don't have to do it that way. And I think it is interesting, because we're going through the process of Dan retiring over the next little while. And so there's a lot of steps that go into that. But I do think that, to Brandon's point, that as far as having a team that is structured so that you don't lose that continuity in all of the planning that's gone before, and all of a sudden you have to start brand new when you're in your 80s or later, of trying to bring a new advisor up to speed with what you've done before, so he doesn't undo everything that you've done.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of different kinds of teams, of financial advisory teams out there. And as a consumer or an investor, I think it's important for you to know exactly how that team is working that you're working with, because it may turn out that they're just a team in name or just a team of convenience. To where you might think that they're all working together and working and communicating about your situation, but really you just have a bunch of advisors that are sharing the title on a team name, but they're working in silos and not really working together and communicating on your information. And so I think that can't be understated, that you do want to understand your advisor's succession plan and how he's grooming his team to continue to work with you throughout your entire life, and then also through the next generation or the next two generations. I'm working with some clients now to where I'd work with the grandparents who have passed at this point. I'm working with their kids, and now I'm working with the grandkids. And we've actually now have accounts set up for the great grandkids because we're setting up education accounts and things like that. And so you want that continuity and that history with your financial advisory team.
I guess if we back up just a little bit, it should be mentioned you're still going to need an advisor in your 80s. In other words, you still need help. What kind of help are you asking from your advisor in your 80s?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that still happen in your 80s and your 90s as far as financial advisory help. One, you're still investing the money and still managing it, but lots of times you get into legacy planning and how that money is going to get passed from one generation to the next, and you're refining that legacy that you've started to put in place in your 60s and 70s, and laws change, circumstances change, family dynamics change, and so you want to continue to review and make sure that all those pieces are in place. Dan, you've seen a lot of this over your career as far as people get into their 80s and generational wealth and different kinds of planning issues that people go in through their 80s. What, as you think about your clients that are in your 80s, and luckily we have a great succession plan and continuity in our team, so it's going to be a very smooth transition. But if it wasn't that situation and you were just handing it off to anybody, to somebody that didn't know you, didn't know your clients well, what kind of hiccups, what kinds of problems do you think might arise from that?
Oh, that would be a lot of issues, a lot of problems. So this is something that's really important. As an advisor, most of us start this career sometimes after a different career. Some of us right out of college. I started when I was 23 years old, 66 now, so going on 43 years. And so when I first started, I had clients that were in their 50s and 40s. A lot of them, most of them were that after they started earning a little money and had some money to invest. That's where they are. Well, those same clients are 80 and 90 now, and some cases or have passed away. And I'm working with the next generation and even a third generation. The process of making sure you have a advisor that will be with you for a long time is important to a client. So the relationships I've had over the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of people, a lot of those clients say, you can't retire until I die. And that's kind of funny to think about, but I've had people tell me that, and
Yeah.
we would laugh and we would say, no, you're going to be fine because there will be a plan in place, and I've already started that process. So Rex and I started talking about this many years ago, and now Brandon's part of this team with Rex and part of my team with me, and so we started this process a long time ago. I stepped out of management about a year and a half ago in order to prepare for a retirement process, which is going to take place for me in the next few months. And so there is a plan in place. I have no problem or concerns for my clients that are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s now, because I know there's a good team and a good succession plan behind me in this process, including our assistants, which work hand in hand with clients. So it's a really important thing. And so if you're in your 80s, you got to make sure that whoever you're working with is part of a real live team, a team that works together, that is in contact with each other on a daily basis, that you can count on having an advisor there or someone as part of the team to help you at any point in time.
Rex, let's go ahead and give yourself a plug. Tell me why someone who's in their 80s now and they're looking for an advisor. I mean, and you said it's not ideal to shop for one in your 80s, so that's what we're trying to prevent if they're with you now. But if they're already in their 80s, why would they come to yourself and your team?
Well, I think because we've done such a great job of our team structure, right? You have Dan, who's now, in his 60s and 40 years of experience, and so there's very little that he hasn't seen during his career. I have 25 years of experience. There's very little I haven't seen during my career. And so if you're in your 80s and you're joining our team, I probably have another 20 years in this business. And so if you're in your 80s, that's going to put you well over 100. And so chances are, I myself will see you throughout the rest of your life, but certainly Brandon will, right? Brandon's in his 30s. And so he's going to see not only you through your life, but he's going to probably see your adult children through their life as well. And then, as Brandon had mentioned, we'll continue to build out this structure, and we'll end up adding another younger advisor to the team so that we continue to have advisors laddered out to make sure that we have that continuity for our clients throughout their entire lifetime so that they're never having to start over with an advisor. There's so many things that happen in your 80s, whether we're dealing with gifting to our kids and grandkids to try and avoid estate taxes, whether we're dealing with long-term care expenses, and what is our plan with that? Are we utilizing insurance and transferring the risk? Are we utilizing our assets? But what is the plan for that? Whether it be charitable gifting strategies that we're implementing, whether we're trying to teach lessons with kids as far as investing and managing money and kind of becoming financially strong. So there's so many things. Then on top of that, you have all the emotional dynamics of changing your investment strategies to where a lot of our clients have amassed significant assets to where we start investing on their kids' risk tolerance and timeframes as opposed to the client, as opposed to the 80-year-old. The 80-year-old will probably never spend all of the money. And so a portion of that, we start having the ability to take on additional risk or to take on additional timeframes. And so working and having to start over with all of those pieces really could prove a nightmare for your parents or your grandparents that are in their 80s. And so working with a team like ours that has put some forethought into the structure to make sure that we have that continuity for you and your loved ones, I think is an enormous competitive advantage for us.
What does the asset allocation look like? You sort of touched on it in that last answer, Rex, but you're in your 80s, and so what does your portfolio look like?
I think every client's going to be very unique, but most of our clients that are in retirement in their 80s, typically we've got a fair amount of safe assets to make sure that we're meeting the daily needs, daily spending, the traveling, whatever it is that they're wanting to do. And that can be everything from, money markets to, CDs to short-term bonds, government bonds, treasury bonds, different things like that. And then typically we've got a portion of their assets that continue to grow so that we can then outpace inflation. And so that's typically where we're at. But somewhere in that 80s, normally their mindset shifts. And normally they start to recognize that, hey, half of this or three-quarters of this, I'm never going to spend. I'm just not spending that much of it, and I don't have a desire to spend it. I have a desire more to pass it on. And so then we start saying, well, for that portion, maybe we can take on some additional risk for that portion of the accounts and start investing with back to a longer time horizon. Instead of a 5 or 10-year time horizon, we can go to a 20 or 30-year time horizon on those assets.
What is gifting? What's legally when you're old enough to, or can you do it at any time? But when you're in your 80s, how do you gift money to family, friends, nonprofits, that kind of thing?
Well, there's gift limits, and so you're limited to gift roughly 16,000, and it adjusts every year. So right now it's $16,000 per person per year. And so Brandon, for instance, I could gift you $16,000 this year, and my wife could gift you $16,000 this year. And so as a couple, we could gift you $32,000 this year.
I've been waiting.
Have you?
Yeah.
You just pretty sure it checks in the mail. Um, so you know, that's without having to file a gift tax form. If you give more than $16,000, then you have two options basically. You can fill out a gift tax form, and it's taxable roughly at the 40% tax rate, above and beyond that. So that doesn't sound very fun to a lot of people. And then, or you can use your unified credit, which is roughly your exemption, your death tax exemption of $1 million. But you have to track that on your tax forms every year, and report that to the IRS so that you don't go over that lifetime gifting exemption amount. And so we try and utilize that because there are some things where it makes a lot of sense to gift early if it's going to, appreciate a lot over the rest of your life, so that we essentially get it out of your estate to avoid estate taxes or death taxes. But when we're giving to individuals, those are kind of the limits. If we're gifting to charity, then obviously there are no limits. You can give as much as you want to charity. It may or may not be deductible on your taxes, depending upon different income limits and tax law. But you can gift as much as you want to charity. So,
Okay. Moving on to taking care of yourself, I guess. The costs involved with care centers, facilities that you may need to enter later, and how does that affect your family, and how's that stuff structured?
Yeah, so long-term care, the primary concern with a care facility or what's often called a long-term care expense is that one spouse will go into a care facility, and that can range in cost. I mean, anywhere between $3,000, $8,000, and even more per month at the care facility, while the other spouse lives at home and continues to want to heat the house, want to, drive. And so your costs really aren't changed very much on the home front. And then meanwhile, the other spouse is in a care facility, and you start distributing, two times or three times as much as you were planning on. And man, that can hurt a financial plan. That can go from, hey, we were planning on living on, $6,000 a month, and now all of a sudden we're distributing $12,000. You can only do that for so long before a plan runs out of money. And then, often what happens is the spouse in the care facility passes away, and then the surviving spouse is left with nothing. And so that's what we're concerned about. That's the major concern. If you're single, that concern's still there, but not as big, right? Because if you deplete all your assets, first of all, it takes longer because you've got your own Social Security to go towards it and everything else. But let's say you do deplete all your retirement savings, equity in your house, then you can go on to Medicaid. And Medicaid, from that point, picks up the rest of the bill. And so, although that's not an ideal scenario, it's also not devastating to a surviving spouse. And so if, as we plan for that, in your 80s, there's not a lot of options. There is such a thing as long-term care insurance, or people will buy life insurance with long-term care. And those work, they're just a little bit expensive. And so we can look at those and see if that makes sense. But for the most part, people love doing the self-insurance, where we save a little bit more into retirement accounts so that the accounts are able to distribute more in the event that we needed a long-term care.
So how is it best, or when should the children of a parent in their 80s start planning for that and putting money away to maybe assist with long-term care?
Yeah, planning for it starts a lot earlier, right? Yeah. Planning for it should start, in your accumulation years while you're working and building up those extra assets. If you find yourself in a spot, though, where you're in your 70s or your 80s and that is coming, then you can kind of, there's a couple things you can do. You can position, maybe kind of cut down on expenses to save a little bit more up. You can also look at alternatives, having kids come in and help with some of the care, having maybe a nurse come by the house rather than, living in a care facility. Sometimes spouses will help care. You can also work with estate planning attorneys if there's a time frame in there where you're like, hey, we don't have an imminent care need right now, but years down the road, we think this is going to happen. And there's some trust work that can be done, although that gets a little bit more complex.
Okay, Rex, Dan, you have comments on the preparation for the care facilities?
Yeah, I think on the care side, like Brandon had mentioned, a lot of the planning starts in your 40s and 50s and 60s, because if you're going to transfer that risk to an insurance company, that's where the sweet spot for the insurance premiums are, is much earlier in life. It's very expensive to go through underwriting when you're in your 80s. Nobody wants to insure you when you're in your 80s, because it's a bad bet for insurance companies. And so if you find yourself in your 80s, then we need to look at, how are we going to do this? Are we going to sell a house? Are we going to, leverage other investments? What are we going to do? And are we wanting to stay in the house? Are we wanting to hire full-time help, round the clock care in the house, which can run, 10, 15, $16,000 a month, for round the clock care in the house. And we have some clients that choose to do that. They have the assets and have done a good job planning, and and they just want to stay in their home. We have other clients that want a more active lifestyle earlier, and so they go into retirement centers and get some social benefits that way. I think the other piece on the 80s and insurance is, lots of times if we did the planning in our 50s and 60s and 70s, some of that planning may have gotten a little bit murky by the time we're in our 80s, and we may remember pieces of what we put in place or the highlights. But it's good to review that. It's good to review those insurance plans regularly, and not only with you, but with the spouse and with the kids, because chances are it's not you that's going to be actually executing on that life insurance policy. And so your kids need to understand, is there a 60-day waiting period? Is there a 90-day waiting period? How many of the active daily living activities, or ADLs, do I have to fail, which is, transferring, toiletry, cleaning, bathing, eating, those kinds of things. But how many of those do I have to fail before the life insurance or the long-term care insurance policy will kick in? And these are all things that we need to be communicating, again, to that next generation down, because they're the ones that are going to step in and do that. And so in our 80s, typically we're doing more family meetings, once a year or once every other year, to make sure that your trustees are up to date, that they know where your healthcare directives are, that they know where your powers of attorney are, make sure that they understand where your assets are, things of that nature. So I think it's really important that you do family meetings with your key trusted people that are going to take on those roles as we get into our 80s. Dan, other thoughts?
Yeah, the key to the whole thing, I believe, is what we've all said. Brandon said it, Rex said it. You just have to plan for it. You should have a plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. In other words, what happens with mom if she falls, or what happens if she just gets sick? What are our plans? The kids, the family, all, even grandkids, need to be involved at some point in time, in a lot of cases, to help out in certain areas. And everybody has this issue. It's not just people that don't have money or people that have a lot of money. It's an issue for a family no matter what, because we all naturally age and get to the point where we can't do some of the things that we used to do. I've often said that you don't remember who came to your first birthday party and your last birthday party. And so someone else has to be there to plan both of those birthday parties for you, and so that's the natural part of life. And the main idea is that you plan for it with your family.
That was awfully bleak.
Well, I was
I just went to my grandson's first year birthday party last week, and he had no idea who was there.
Yeah, he doesn't know who you are, huh, Dan?
He was smiling. He was having fun.
Smiling.
Somebody else planned it for him.
Well, I got to listen to. I was privileged enough to listen to a chat by Tammy Sloan. We're in Utah, so the Coach Sloan's wife, who he was married to when he died, and she retold the story where I think he slipped on some ice and broke his arm, and there was very little health issues prior, but then he went under like a general anesthesia to fix the broken arm, and that triggered an underlying disease. And it wasn't long after that until he needed care. And so it can happen where they're healthy one minute and not the next. It doesn't matter who they are, So, and I thought it was a pretty interesting story how fast it happened,
Right.
Which is kind of scary. So that planning has to happen in advance. Rex, let's pretend we want to give all of our money away.
I'm checking my accounts right now, Brandon.
Well, I know you're giving me some, so that was really thoughtful of you. The charitable aspect of giving when you are in your 80s and 90s, or just giving that money to the charities that you are passionate about. Why should you do it, and how does it benefit? Other than just being nice and giving money to things you care about, how does it benefit you financially?
Well, I think anytime we're giving money away, it's a very personal decision by a client, because they obviously worked very hard for this money and are stressed and over all the years. And so typically when they decide to give the money away, whether it be to kids, grandkids, charity, family charitable foundation, whatever the case may be, typically they've got a fairly strong core belief of what they want to accomplish with that. The problem is typically sometimes it's hard to articulate that. Sometimes it's hard to put that into words, what really you're wanting to do. And so a big part of that is us talking to them, figuring out what exactly are you trying to do, and then what's the best avenue to do that in. And so that's what we're looking at when we're looking at the financial ramifications of giving money. There's a lot of it comes down to what you want, how we're going to do it. There's obviously the investment side. Do we still control the investments, or does the person receiving the funds control the investments? Do we get a tax break today, or do we get a tax break over a long period of time? Does the gift happen today, or does the gift happen upon my passing or upon some event? There's a lot of estate planning pieces that go into this, and a lot of acronyms that we touched on just briefly in our estate planning podcast a while ago. But we talked about TCLATs, testamentary charitable lead annuity trusts, and testamentary charitable remainder annuity trusts. All these different tools that we utilize for the gifting process, depending upon what we're trying to do, and each one of them has very specific financial pieces to it, as far as the tax write-offs or the growth and how that growth accrues, or who gets to benefit from that for how long of a time period, and does the asset come back into the family, does the asset not, does it stay in the family, and then at some date and time it goes over to the charity, and so the charity has an interest in it but no receipt for 10 or 20 years. And so it's a very complex issue that we deal with our top 10-20% of our clients, to try and figure out what the best avenue is.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Because ECHLs are huge in Utah. If you had any idea of how they're structured, or how they do all their charitable giveaways.
It's a very complex structure, I can tell you that.
One thing with donations, I feel like a lot of times people think, wealthy people give donations for the tax benefits. But the reality is that if you give money away, even you're never going to get 100% benefit back. Right? Like you give that away and you're getting a tax benefit, and that might help you. That might be a 25 or even a 50% tax benefit. But ultimately, if the goal here is to retain and spend more money, charitable donations are never like going to be your golden bullet. However, if you're already going to give money to a charity, maybe it's a church, maybe it's a charity that you regularly donate to, there's ways that we can donate to those charities more efficiently. For example, we can send money out of an IRA directly to those charities, and so it's never recognized as tax to you. Now, of course, it would have been better to take that money straight out of your IRA, pay taxes on it, and spend the remainder. But if you're already going to donate to these charities because you believe in it, because you want to help out, then there's more efficient ways to do it, where we can end up giving more money to the charities rather than to the government. And so I think that's where the planning comes in, because there's a lot of different strategies and a lot of different ways we can do that. And so ultimately we need to sit down and say, all right, what do you want? What do you want to do? How much money do you want to give to these charities? And then, let us try and figure out what an efficient way might be to do that.
Dan, do you have any comments on charitable giving?
It's something that most people do. They have a cause or something they believe in. And once you get to 72, the way I'm planning on doing it is through my IRA. Instead of taking the money out of my IRAs and paying taxes, I'm planning on donating that stock it's usually appreciated stock, hopefully, to a charity. And so most people do that, and that's a great way to do it. Something you need to have a financial planner, you need to have help to be able to do that.
Yeah. Rex, I don't know if I've got three options in my head. One, you didn't get a whole heck of a lot of sleep. Two, you have a cold. Or three, it was like an all-nighter at the casino, because the voice is a little rough today.
Yes. Let's just say yes.
Yes to all
No.
three.
No casino.
Yeah.
Yet, but
Okay.
yeah, my kids decided to bring home and share. We've worked with our kids a lot over the years about sharing, and sharing is caring.
Yeah.
And all those kinds of things. And one of them decided to share a little scratchy throat with me.
A scratchy throat. Okay.
Feeling great, but I definitely have a little bit deeper, voice here today.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm glad you feel okay then.
Yeah.
Well, Brandon, let's bring you in here, because you've mentioned you've already got an estate plan and you're in your 30s. And so talk to me about the importance of estate planning and what happens in your 80s.
Yeah. So the answer is always, it depends with this stuff. And it depends, because I've seen people who've put together an estate plan, in their 60s, and they just carried that the rest of their life. And it was good, right? Nothing really changed on the family front. Nothing, there weren't any dramatic changes. It's still a good idea to review that estate plan every 3 to 5 years. Go through it, make sure that the people that you listed as successor trustees, right, to take and manage things after you're gone, that they're still, alive, that they're willing to do it, that they're capable of doing it. That they're still, on your good list, whatever it may be, right? It's important to review. But then I've seen others where things change. Kids pick up bad habits or addictions, or, and the purpose of an estate plan is to efficiently pass your assets from you to your kids. And usually it's to most benefit those kids, however that is, right? If they are a great person, but just spend every dollar that they ever touch, then maybe we kind of control how that distribution is made. Or maybe you don't care and you say, hey, let them have the greatest year of their life. And then, they can go back to life as it was before.
Yeah.
And it really, there isn't a right or a wrong answer. It just depends on, what you want. And so that's why we say, review it every 3 to 5 years, read through it. If you were to pass away today or over the next 3 years, how does that look? Is that going to be what you would want to have happen with your money? And if so, great. If not, then we might need to amend it, right? We go to an attorney, they can make some changes on it. That usually doesn't cost too much. Other times, if we're a whole overhaul, right, we need to change everything, then we'll just write a whole new trust.
Dan, as you get closer to retirement, what's your thoughts heading into not having to work and then looking at your estate plan?
So I just have my estate plan updated just this year, actually 4 or 5 months ago. And I did that in preparation for retirement. I have a list of 12 or 15 things that I'm going to plan on doing. And part of it is charity related, volunteering, that type of thing. But it's important that everybody has to have an estate plan. With Brandon and for instance, his age, the most important part of that estate probably is what happens to his kids if something happens to him and his wife. Well, I don't have that issue now. My kids are raised. They all have their own kids. And so that's not the most important part of my estate plan. The most important part of my estate plan is how do I distribute it to the causes that I care about and my wife cares about, and how do we distribute it down through our family in a good manner so that we don't ruin any of their lives by giving them too much money at the wrong time in their life, or not enough, or whatever it might be, so that they can have a good, happy life and make good decisions, I guess. So that's how I view the estate plan.
Rex, if you make it all the way to your 80s and you don't have an estate plan yet, that can still be done, right?
Well, I love estate planning, right? I mean, this is truly a passion of mine, is estate planning. Everybody has an estate plan, period. Everybody has an estate plan. The question is, are you going to control it and you decide what your estate plan is, or are you going to let the government control it and you're going to just go with the default government estate plan?
Yeah, I totally
That's the
trust them to
question.
make the right decision in all the things. So yeah,
Right, in every aspect of your life,
yeah,
especially when it
100%.
deals with money
They really
and the
get
passing
me.
of that.
Yeah, they,
Yeah,
they
they really understand who Brandon
yeah,
Long is.
yeah, comes across their desk all the
So
time.
yeah, but everybody, honestly, everybody has an estate plan, right?
Yeah,
And if you die without a will, or you die without, then it's called, dying intestate, and there's specific law that happens. It's public, right? And so you're gonna bury yourself in front of, the entire world, or anybody that wants to look into it, as to what's going on, and people can contest it, people can drag it out, and so you may end up none of your money going anywhere that you wanted it to go.
mm,
But everybody has an estate plan. The question is, are you going to control it?
yeah,
And I think that in your 80s, by then you certainly have reached a mature enough age that you can, do your estate plan yourself and control it. The other thing that I find is frequently in your 80s, a lot of people haven't reviewed their estate plan for 10, 15, 20 years.
mm,
And so I was reviewing one here just maybe a couple months ago, and there were two things in the estate plan that kind of caught me off guard. One, it was that there was a certain amount of money going to a pet that had passed on, 13 years ago,
yeah.
and the
I
pet
just
was
love
no
the
longer
pet made it
there.
in the estate plan. That's fantastic.
The
So
pet made it in.
yeah,
It was a loved pet for
yeah,
sure, but it was still in the estate plan, and there wasn't a clause in there. It wasn't written as to what happens if the pet had gone,
mm,
and so it just left some of the money just in limbo, and which causes additional legal work and expense and time at the end as to how do we deal with this. And so that gets a little bit nebulous. Then the other one was that they had a nephew in the estate plan, and since then the nephew has kind of written off the family,
mm.
and this particular client had kind of written off the nephew, and yet the nephew is standing to inherit, a third of the estate, and in this case it was significant amounts of money.
All of a sudden
And
they're
so
family again.
yeah,
Yeah,
so we wanted to make sure that got cleaned up, and so I think it is important every 3 to 5 years just to review it, get it out, read it, make sure that the people that are going to be controlling it, the successor trustees, and typically that goes down 2 or 3 steps, are in place. Make sure that who the money's going to still makes sense for what you want to do, and when you want it to go to them makes sense as well. So
This is a perfect time
sounds good.
for a shameless plug. Check your beneficiaries on your 401k plans, on your
Yeah,
IRA plans,
yeah.
on everything else, because always there's some time. I think, Rex, you were sharing there was someone this year that had a not so pleasant experience.
yeah, I mean, there was one this year that I think a first wife, after being married 3 times, inherited the funds because they were the beneficiary of the 401k plan, and he just never got around to changing it. And so wife 2, that was the mother of 1 or 2 kids, and wife 3, that was his current wife of 10 plus years, received 0,
Mm,
right? And kids received 0.
yeah,
And wife 1 was elated. Wife 1 was happy.
Jeez. Yeah,
And so, so it remains to be seen if she decides to do anything else with that. But anyway, it is. Every year there's somebody that we're surprised by, because every year we really hammer, check your beneficiaries, make sure they're updated, make sure that if you have individual beneficiaries, that they're updated, you have contact information. If we have a trust, make sure you understand why we have a trust listed as a beneficiary, and what the financial consequences of that may or may not be if we have a trust listed.
Brandon, you know what time it is?
Time for some more numbers.
Some more numbers. Yeah, let's do it.
I know. I thought you were leading me into that earlier when you're like sharing Brandon. And I was like, share some. Anyway. No, this is a good one. National Association of Realtors came out, and it was interesting. The first time home buyers reached a record low this last year, which I think, makes sense. So on this one, the age of the first-time home buyer reached an all-time high. And I think the buyers were low. So anyway, 26% of all buyers this year were first-time home buyers. And that's compared to last year was 34% were first-time. I mean, that's crazy where you go from 34% down to 26%. And obviously, I mean, given the scenario, with rising interest rates and high cost of housing, I mean, it's really, really a hard conundrum, but yeah, interesting stats on that.
What's the average age of the first-time home buyer? Does it say?
Yeah, typical first-time home buyer was 36 years old, which is up from 33 years old. So age is going up, and it's a hard environment.
Yeah, so buying a house in your 20s is not easy.
No, and it's a hard nut to crack. That's why we had that recent podcast, where we, had a realtor on and talked through, how, if you're in a hard place, how do you get into a house? And I don't know that there's any perfect answer, but man, it's a rough landscape out there.
Rex, do you think that'll get better next year?
I don't think that stat will get better next year. I think, we probably have a couple more interest rate hikes to go during this interest rate cycle. And so that's gonna be a little more difficult for people to afford their first home. I anticipate prices to come down slightly on homes, but we'll see. But I don't think it'll be overly significant on the housing prices. If they drop, it'll be minor and not enough to offset the higher interest rates. So this next year, I'm not anticipating that stat to change. I think in 2024, we probably will begin to see that stat reverse and go the other direction. But I think this next year is going to continue to be a challenging year for first-time home buyers.
What about, because this is for our friends in their 80s and 90s, and they're leaving property to their kids who potentially may be in their 20s. How good of an idea is that?
Ooh, biggest mistake. One of the biggest, not leaving
wow.
your house to your kids isn't the biggest mistake. I misspoke. But one of the biggest mistakes that I see of people in their 80s, and typically it's late 80s when I see this, is they will just add their son or daughter's name to the title on the house, thinking that, this is going to make it really simple for me to transfer the ownership of the house.
And it does make it simple.
It does make it simple, but there are definitely a couple of consequences to that. The first consequence is, how much earlier in this discussion did we talk about that we could gift without a gift tax?
16.
Right. And so typically if you put somebody's name on your house, you're essentially giving them half of your house value, right? So if you have $1 million house, then effectively you just gave that person $500,000.
So do they need to claim that on their taxes that year?
Yeah,
well,
they're supposed to.
And they forget, I'm sure. So then when do they find out?
I'm sure they forget.
Or just not know. And
Right.
Yeah.
And so that happens frequently, right? And so if they end up getting audited, then that could be an issue. And either they would have to claim their part of their lifetime exemption, which is possible, right, to do, or they would have to pay the gift tax, roughly 40% gift tax on that $500,000 in that situation, right? So that's the first consequence that most people aren't aware of. The second is that when you pass away, you get a step up in cost basis on your assets. And so if as a parent, if you bought that as an 80-year-old, if you bought that house for a long time ago, 50 years ago, and you paid $40,000 for that house, and today that house is worth, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 today, then when you pass away, you get a step up in cost from $40,000 to the current value of that house, thus avoiding having to pay capital gains on the sale for that entire amount. But if you give it to your child and you put your name on there, then essentially you also give them your cost basis of $40,000. And so then if you go to sell the house, or they go to sell the house after you pass away, they don't get a step up in basis. And so now they're paying capital gains on the entire increase from 40,000 up to that $800,000 house. And so that's a significant financial, pain, if you will, cost or mistake if you decide to do that. And a lot of people do that. This is a very common mistake we see of people doing in their 80s.
Yeah. So what's the best way to transfer a home that's paid off to kids, probably multiple, 3, 4, 5 kids or whatever? What's the best way to make sure if, say, one of the kids wants to keep it in the family?
So if it's titled in the trust, right, then you can live there, right? As the 80-year-old parent, you can live there as long as you want. And then when you're done, you've got the successor trustee at that point that can manage that for your benefit while you're living. And then when you pass, then they get the step up in basis. And then at that point, they can sell it. They can, negotiate with the other kids to see if one of them wants to buy it, or whether one of the kids, it's their inheritance and the other kids are splitting cash and investments. There's lots of ways to do that, but that's the best way to probably avoid the gift tax or the lack of capital gains and step up in basis taxes.
This is why we talk to the professionals, folks. Bring them in, because we don't always know the consequences or the questions to ask, and that's why you guys exist. So very important. Okay, so let's lastly here, take us out. Why are we involving the kids? And this is part of it. Maybe one wants, maybe they're all assuming that all three kids don't care about this house, and then suddenly one of them does care. And so when you're setting up your financials and you're talking about your financials in your 80s, when do you bring the kids in? Rex, you want to start?
Sure. So I think you bring the kids in fairly early. Lots of times we'll bring the kids in later in our 70s for the first time and start to go through the basics of the estate plan with them. Lots of times we won't go through detailed finances with them just yet, but typically we'll start there. I think there's lots of examples that both Dan and Brandon can share of families. One of the main reasons that families fall apart is due to lack of communication. Is mom and dad didn't tell the kids what the plan is, and if you want that, then that's going to be an issue.
Yeah, Brandon.
Yeah, and when we say kids, I mean, if you're in your 70s or your 80s, kids are, in their 50s and 60s.
Right.
But I mean, it's also important. It depends on the situation, obviously. But I've watched as people have inherited money or have been given money and haven't had any investment experience, right? And you have these, the parents who have been through the storms, right? They've been through the financial downturns, the ups, and they are like a captain on the ship, just sailing right through it, and it, long term make great decisions. But then, man, you turn over the helm to sorry all the sailing references.
Can you tell he owns a sailboat?
You turn it over to someone who doesn't have that experience. Maybe they've done a little bit in the 401k, but all of a sudden a big downturn comes and they're thinking, holy cow, I've got to protect this, right? How am I going to protect that? Well, I'm going to sell it and then I'm going to try and buy it. They start doing all sorts of different stuff, and you can help kind of help the next generation understand how investing works, and that, hey, we've been through this, right? And this is how we get through it. And these are the do's and these are the don'ts, and helping and involving kids can help them down the road as they start, investing for themselves.
I feel like next month's podcast, every time you talk, you have to include a sailing metaphor.
You got it.
You have to figure that out. Dan, it's sort of a cheat code with your kids, because your kids grew up with a financial planner at the helm there in your family. But how much did you bring them in? When did you bring them in? Have they been along the whole time? How are they involved with your financials as you get set to retire and move on to the next stage of life?
They're not involved over a long time, but they have been involved recently, especially my oldest son, who's going to be the executor for my trust. But let me just talk for a second about the next generation up. My father, my father-in-law, who are in their 80s. And one of the most important things that I think that they should do, or you should do when you're in your 80s, is first of all, you have an estate plan and you talk about the big stuff, the money and all of that. But what about the watch, the ring? What about the cars that are in the garage that are brand new, maybe in some cases? What about the favorite painting, or something that's important to the whole family that they've seen for years and years and years as they visited your house? How do you distribute that, or how do you plan for that? You need to make a list of those things that are special to you, that mean something to you, because they probably mean something to somebody else. And I don't know how many times we've heard stories about dad promised me that. Well, no, he promised me that. And then the third daughter, he promised me that. And that's where problems come into play, with not necessarily the big estate plan issues or big items or money in some cases. Sometimes it's just the little things.
Yeah.
It might be his watch or his ring or his 4 rings or whatever it might be. And how do you distribute that? It needs to be a plan for that. It needs to be written down so everybody's aware of it.
Excellent discussion today. Rex, did you have anything else?
No, I think that is the biggest issue, is that in estate planning, we call that a Schedule A, and that's what people have to fill out on their own because it's personal property. And it's like Dan said, the rings, the guns, the trucks, the cars, the sentimental things.
Yeah.
And that's where feelings get hurt. And that's where you'll see, brothers and sisters harbor resentment for the rest of their lives against their other siblings. And almost every parent that we meet with, one of their biggest things, important issues that they bring to us is, I just want to make sure that my kids are happy. I just want to make sure that they get along. I want to make sure that they're still getting together when I'm gone and that they're there for each other. And unbeknownst to them, to the 80-year-olds, the very thing that they want, they're creating conflict in by not designating these things in writing for those kids and communicating it clearly to them.
Yeah.
But because they typically take the mindset, well, I'll be gone. Let them figure that out. They can draw names. They can do whatever they want. They'll figure it out, and that'll work out. And it doesn't work out.
I mean, I'm laughing, but I'm the draw names thing. Oh man, that is not going to go well. I don't think at all.
Yeah, it's hard. We've seen that in trust. We've seen, flip coins. We've seen draw numbers, draw straws. We've seen all kinds of things.
Yeah,
so
that does not sound. That sounds like trouble waiting to happen.
I had one client that said she was gonna take a bunch of money out of the bank, print it, and like hide it all throughout the house and just have a giant treasure hunt.
Okay.
Which I thought was a great idea.
Sure.
But then I've heard other ones where that's what it turned into, right? Where all the kids were just scavenging through clothes and through things to try and find valuables, and emotionally that was very hard, for some people to watch, and I get it. And so I think it's easy to, from a 10,000 foot level, be like, they're all going to be happy, I'm leaving them all this money, but not realize the nuances. And especially after you've lost someone, it can be really hard. So I think, focusing on that planning and focusing on working with professionals and focusing on making sure everything's just in line, it goes a long, long way.
It's just a story, but we had an uncle pass where you go to the house, and it is the weird small things, Rex, like you said, like that his son found like a Stanley lunchbox that he used, and me thinking that the son was not too happy with the dad at the time, was not going to want this, so I'm like, oh yeah, I'll take it. And turns out he really wanted that lunchbox, and it was like, oh yes, I mean, it's your dad, like take it, it's yours. But it's those little things like that you never know that could turn into big fights in the family, and then you're in trouble.
Yeah, and nobody wants to talk about it, right? Because we're talking about our own mortality. We're talking about death, and kids don't want to think about their parents being dead, and parents know that that's a hard discussion for their kids, and so nobody wants to talk about it. It's like the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
And yet the reality is, the more we talk about it, the smoother that is for everybody.
Yeah.
And it is just part of the circle of life. It's going to happen to all of us sooner or later, and so you might as well just talk about it. And just throw it on the table, and let's just have that discussion. It's the only way I know how to deal with people, is we throw it on the table, we talk about it and we figure it out. So
Rex, your job is to have uncomfortable conversations. Is that what you're saying?
that's, I think that I'm going to work that into a tagline somehow, but I think that's great. Our team is great at having uncomfortable conversations.
Yep. That's good. I like it. And making them sound comfortable. So,
Sure.
Brandon, thanks so much. Dan, thanks for joining us. Rex, listen, the phenomenal advice, and they've got years of experience. So planwithbaxter.com to help you. If you have someone in your families in your 80s, you're listening to this podcast and you are in your 80s, first of all, thank you, because that's pretty sweet if you are. But most likely you're probably younger and your mom or dad or grandparent is in their 80s and needs to hear this. So Plan with Baxter, it's free, right? Rex, they can just call you and they don't have to
Absolutely.
pay anything. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Sounds good. Like our Facebook page, keep up on the podcast, follow us on Instagram at Pines_podcast, and subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can see our wonderful, beautiful faces on the YouTube at Through the Pines Podcast. This has been Through the Pines, reminding you to use yesterday's dollars to finance tomorrow's dreams.